believe we have Amaud back here.
I think that was, yeah, I think my system just crashed for a second,
Yeah.
so I had to reboot it.
Welcome back.
So, now I'm a paper person, so like being like pulled in the world, you know, I mean, I really like just, you know, it's the stress of it, you know, in terms of like kind of things falling apart, you know, so I apologize for that. So yeah, I think Paul, like the I guess the short answer to your question is, I think I understand that there are some kind of difficulties to it. You know, so I do like the opportunity to be able to kind of like talk through them, right? But you know, whatever your experience is, I think that's kind of the experience. Like there isn't like a, you know, like one way to kind of read or experience these. So I guess that's it. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. That was just something that struck me as I listened to you last night. So, and not something that I could flesh out in a text question. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Actually, can I follow up with that? Because in Amaud, you mentioned, you know, how many references you use. And certainly your second book is just all references. It's loaded with it. But you, as you say, you have a lot of references in this book that cover a lot of cultural ground, and references that will be available to one audience, maybe not another, but other references, you know, to a different audience. And so I wonder how, you know, that's a choice you're making that will include at different points in a poem or in the book will include or exclude different audiences. And I wonder how, you know, how much that matters, how much you think about like who's gonna get this reference, or how you weigh that out as a writer.
Yeah, I mean, I think trying to figure out like our common ground has probably been like the hardest part of my experience as a writer. Like, I know, like, I don't know how to talk to people here about how I grew up, and I don't know how to talk to people at home about how I live here. And, you know, so if I go home and say, hey, like I wrote a poem about the Delphonics, they're like, woohoo, that's great, right? Like everybody's really happy. You know, if I'm like, it's like, oh, like I also like reference like Orpheus in a poem, everybody's like, you know, like, what are you talking about? You know, so I think I purposely wrote a book, you know, thinking about like certain movie references, like, you know, there's the movie Sparkle. That was actually remade with Jordan Sparks like a few years ago, but the original Sparkle stars Irene Cara and Lynette McKee. Curtis Mayfield did the soundtrack for that. It's incredible, musically, like it's an incredible movie, right? So this is one of the movies that I just like loved as a kid. We all like kind of like watched it, you know, kind of all the time. It's just one of like the, you know, like the staples, right? So if you know the movie, the star of it is actually not Sparkle, but it's Sparkle's older sister, and everyone called her Sister. So so I wrote a poem about Lynette McKee starring her. So if you know the movie, then that reference and then everything that's kind of happening in it, you know, would make sense. Or there's a film called Nothing But a Man that stars an actor named Ivan Dixon, and Abby Lincoln plays the love interest. Abby Lincoln from When Melinda Sings. She didn't do a lot of acting. I mean, she's an incredible artist, you know, kind of across the board, but this is one of her few acting roles. But Yaphet Kotto, who you may know from a number of things, but I guess maybe like his bigger role was in the first Alien with Sigourney Weaver. You know, Yaphet Kotto has like a supporting role in Nothing But a Man. So I wrote a poem, you know, about a fairly obscure Black film about another kind of minor character, right? So it's the, I'm kind of just digging deeper into like my own mythology or my own kind of like past, rather than what sometimes I feel is like kind of pandering, where it's like, oh, I'll write about Lot's wife, or so like I'm thinking about my audience here, and I'm profoundly neglecting like the artistry that I was born into, right? So, so I think I did anticipate that, like a white audience, like a Midwestern audience, might struggle with these poems a bit, but I always had to like Google, like these terms and phrases when I was trying to figure out like kind of what an obscure reference was, or it's like reading Eliot, and doing the work of trying to figure out everything that's going on in in proof rock or in the wasteland, and not that I'm trying to like create like my own version of that, but maybe Compton is a little like the wasteland, like in that sense, right? Like that sense of kind of decay and despair and isolation. So again, like I'm creating like a private mythology, and maybe the confusion is an invitation, right? Like if you're frustrated or confused, like you do one or two things, right? Like you either turn away and say, okay, well, obviously this isn't for me, or you dig deeper and you say, okay, well, who is Yaphet Kotto, or who is, Lynette McKee, and what happened to Teddy Pendergrass, right? And you begin to do that, and then like that has its own metaphoric weight. So like as soon as you figure out like what the references are, then there's like the story inside of the story. So like every poem is an invitation into like a completely different conversation. Even I begin the book with a group called 1978, and the lead singer for Switch, it's an R&B group, and the lead singer for Switch is named Bobby DeBarge, and Bobby DeBarge was the oldest brother in the DeBarge family. Developed a drug habit, was this really like pretty man, like kind of high falsetto, but he was kind of rough. He's from Grand Rapids in Michigan. The whole family's from Grand Rapids. And when his life fell apart, the rest of his family formed this group called DeBarge. And they also had a really like messy family history. So like, there are all of these layers, in this book. It's like, but I'm kind of inviting you. It's like, well, I don't know anything about Switch, right? Like I imagine that you would look it up and then you would see that DeBarge was one of the members. And it's like, oh, well, there's a poem called DeBarge in the second half of the book. So it's like there are all of these Easter eggs. I guess that's the best way, or it kind of works as a Russian nesting doll, right? Like, there's a doll inside of a doll inside of a doll, right? So like the more you kind of peel things back, there are these echoes that kind of pull you through. But the surface reality, I accept that like you may not get it at all, right? So then it's just like, there's a poem that references Candy Staten, who's a disco queen in the late 70s, and a quote from Phyllis Wheatley, who was her own kind of disco queen, in the 1770s, right? So I'm thinking about like 70s girls and romance, right? But if you don't know Candy Staten, you lose a part of it. So again, like these are invitations, right? Like opportunities to kind of like peel back those layers to figure out what's really going on in these poems. And that's just like my own, maybe getting a little older and kind of feeling like, I'm just going to let my life be, kind of front and center, right? The whole thing I said about code switching, like I'm not code switching here, right? Like I'm actually just using my own voice and like the intimacy in terms of the way I understand things. And then I'm forcing you as a room to adapt to me rather than, trying to figure out like how to help you understand the poems like in the ways that I've kind of done in the past. So it's the opposite of minstrelsy, right? Like it's me just kind of using my own voice and all the complications of like my own kind of like cultural makeup. It's a long answer, but
it's a great answer. Other questions or comments for Amaud?
I just want to say real quick, that answer, just, you should have heard me over here. I was like, yes, I just got really excited for that answer. I love that idea of like making the conscious decision to not have to code switch, because I've been in spaces where they're like, well, no one's going to understand this. And I'm like, well, you're not going to understand it, but it's not for you. And that is okay. And so to hear you talk about like making that conscious decision to be like, this is me on the page, you go figure it out. Like, or it's not for, like, I don't know. I just got really excited. So thank you for that.
Well, you know, I mean, this is like the difficult work of integration, right? That like let's like talk about how we have different like lived experiences, right? We have different tastes, right? Like we grew up in spaces where they're different. At the same table, right? Like as a baseline, as it, right? So here we are, kind of this like, you know, integrated environment. How do we manage authority, right? Like how do we create like a space where we can all bring like our baggage to the table? And you know, usually, you know, like integration is you kind of bring in like you know, there's like a majority and then there's like a little like kind of seasoning, right? You know, just to like make it interesting. And you know, but that difference doesn't affect the larger narrative, right? Like it's just about, okay, well, you know, like adopt, right? Just like figure out like how to mainstream these conversations. And I think what's exciting about what's happening right now is there is more effort, and there's clearly like an opportunity to do like deep dives, you know, on any subject, right? Like whatever I reference, like there's a massive amount of information like on it, right? Like people, what we know now is that people obsess about the smallest things, right? Like there should be, I'm sure there's like a whole like Reddit group, you know, for like what really happened when Teddy Pendergrass, like, you know, got in that car accident, right? You could find bottomless amounts of information if you just, you know, scratch the surface. So I just, so often I'm thinking about that. It's like, I know there are people out there who obsess about the things that I obsess about, you know, so like, while that might not be mainstream, I think what's happening is like, we don't even understand, this is like the way all of these like social media bubbles work. It's like, we don't even know what the mainstream is anymore, right? Like there's no common thread, right? Like we don't even know how to like engage that conversation. Like, what do we all know? Like, what are we all passionate about? And it creates more community, but it also creates profound isolation because everybody kind of wants to be, you know, at the center, you know, or we desire an art that can kind of unify us because that's what we're used to. You know, it's like the, you know, the sitcom that everybody would like imagine like all of America is laughing at the exact same time because they're watching like Happy Days, you know, and all communities, right? That we had a art that defined us, but now everybody's watching whatever they want to watch whenever they want to watch it, you know. So there's a lot of choice, right? Like YouTube, whatever, right? Like the streaming services, there's so much choice that, you know, our tastes are so connected to who we are. We don't have the other thing, right? Which is just like, I think maybe like Game of Thrones was maybe the last thing that a lot of people watched together. Like people said that that's probably like the last show, like unifying like a group, right? So now all of our art is like really personal, right? All of our art is connected to like our own obsessions. So the challenge is, well, like, how do we do something that is understanding the obsession-oriented culture that we have, but that also acknowledges people outside of these bubbles? And I don't know how to do that. I mean, I think it's difficult to figure out how to do both, but it's probably the challenge. Like, we all have these really complicated political and aesthetic camps, right? Like, where we are, how we see our identity, but then how do you reach outside of that bubble? You know, like, what does that work? And is that minstrelsy? Is that pandering? I think the next 10 years, that's going to be the real work of music, of poetry, the visual arts. Again, you know, we're beginning a new decade. There's a profound generational shift. So, you know, some of these things I think are the seeds for something that we can't fully articulate, but it is very new. This is something that I think is going to be transformative. And I'm not saying that about my own work, but just like what I feel happening in the culture.
I just found this really profound. And the example I keep thinking of is, I remember when Hanif Abdurraqib came to Iowa City and did a reading a few years ago and said he was working on a book about a tribe called Quest. And I remember thinking, like, gosh, that's so niche, you know, like, and obviously it's, even what you're talking about today is even more niche. And just having seen this trend towards our obsessions and these bubbles of communities that are obsessed at the same rate that we are of things, and thinking about that trend continuing and how that will both isolate us through aesthetic. Yeah, this whole talk has really, again, just given me a lot to think about. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like for my generation, A Tribe Called Quest is like the Beatles, right? So
Yeah.
so the idea that, like, oh, that seems just like kind of a cute project is like that, like, you know, that was transformative, right? Like, there's certain things in the culture that, like a blackness that could be, like, quote unquote, like, different, you know, like a kind of like, you can love jazz and you could be political, and like that articulation of Black masculinity in particular, like, really made my life possible. So, like,
Yeah.
you know, Tribe Called Quest, De La Soul, right? So yeah, as a project, you know, that really says something about where you're coming from. It's like, oh, well, that just seems like, you know, you have like a little thing that you're interested in. It's like, no, right? Like, this is the argument for, like, someone
That was zeitgeist for you.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
But it's hard to, like, how you maybe 6 years ago, I made a reference to Tribe Called Quest in one of my workshops, and none of the students had heard of them. You know, like, it was just the, you know, like the cricket, you know, kind of thing. But people cycled in and out, like, in the culture, right? Like, you know, I remember talking about adaptations of the Odyssey, and my students hadn't seen Oh Brother Where Art Thou, you know, for instance, like the Coen Brothers film. So, like, again, like, you know, there are these threads where we're not all watching the same movies or listening to the same music. So we have to do so much work to try and create these different reference points or access points to kind of, like, build knowledge.
He inspired me with that book to, like, dig in and start listening more and understand how I was not part of that, you know, sort of circle of influence, and yet became so later in life.
Yeah, no, he's a great, like, person.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we have time for, say, one more question. Anyone want to throw one more thing in the ring here? No, it is Sunday morning, as Amaud said.
I have one, but I want
Yeah.
to make room for, like, other people. So, because I already asked one.
I love your questions, Bird, so I want to hear it.
Yeah.
Yeah, hit it, Heather.
Go ahead, Heather.
I'm ready.
Well,
I'm ready.
I'm super interested in, so I'm all about like process right now and like trying to figure out, I'm leaning more into process, whereas like as when I was an earlier writer, like, you know, you go through that phase where you're like, I'm not editing work. What is that? And then you like graduate into more of appreciation for it. And so really curious on what your like editing process is and how you kind of work through that, because I feel like that's always a question. So I work with a literary nonprofit in Chicago called Young Chicago Authors, and a lot of the time the coaches are like, I can get my students to write, but when the editing comes, I have no idea what to do. So I've like become obsessed with like editing techniques and things like that. So I'd love to hear how you kind of approach that part of the process.
In this, I mean, I think about things phrase by phrase, line by line. Maybe my partner will say like, I'm just writing slowly, just kind of like looping, like it's like, when are you gonna finish that sentence? Just get there, and part of it is I just like to turn the work, inside out. Like I really and maybe it's just because of the pandemic and like we have so little control over our lives. I've just been geeking out on grammar handbooks, and like I'll do like sentence diagrams of other people's poems. I'll just like write out the sentences in my notebook, and then I'll kind of mark what all the phrases, right? Like, is this the gerund? Like what, what's being modified? And usually like we talk about syntax often in poetry, but I think like people actually don't know what they're talking about, right? Like it's just, how do you turn a phrase, inside out, right? Like what part is modifying what, right? Like, is it, adverbial or adjectival? Like we're syncing or linking, participial phrases, parentheticals, appositives, right? Like you have to kind of understand, there's the poetics, right? In terms of like metaphor and music, but then there's also just like the beauty of the sentence, right? Like, what does it mean to kind of write a really interesting sentence? So when I'm revising, I'm not thinking about this on the front end, but when I go back, I'm like, okay, well, like what kind of sentence is this? Like, what am I saying and when am I saying it? And then how am I, like all modification is complication, right? Like usually we have one simple thing that we want to say, and then we're adding layers, right? So David Orr had like the great, or Gregory Orr, excuse me, kind of said that there are like two ways to think about editing. We can think of it as a sculptor, where we have like a huge block of marble and we're kind of whittling it down to a figure, right? So it's Michelangelo, you see the object through the stone, right? So you have like a big messy thing and you're polishing it to kind of make it beautiful, right? So that's one mode. The other mode is, that you have a skeletal structure and you're adding layers, right? Like the modeling structure, where you have a, if you draw, this, like you begin with a kind of like a stick structure, and then you add complication, right? To create body, from bone. So, personally, I begin with kind of like a skeletal structure, and then I add, usually I have like a image or a phrase. I'm not even sure how to like finish the sentence. And then I'll just kind of, add language. I'm like waiting for sound. Jean Valentine, Curtis mentioned last night. Jean was she began with a block, and then she would essentially like cut out all of the language in her work, that she would do like erasure projects of her own writing. So she'd do these kind of like massive first drafts, and then she would just cut out as much as possible. So like whatever was left was kind of like the ghost of like what she began with. So you kind of have to figure out what works best, you know, for you. You know, but first word is not best word, right? Like doubt yourself constantly. And then I think if you go back to you know, the famous drafts that Elizabeth Bishop did of One Art, you know, when it began as a really messy poem, and she didn't think that it was going to be a villanelle.
What you doing? Elmo.
And it just you know, and it just kind of became like, you really like see the process. Or even Langston Hughes, his poem Harlem, you know, What Happens to a Dream Deferred. If you look at like early drafts of that, you know, there were these questions, like he was writing about Cuba, you know, and then it just became something else, you know. So the question about the draft and like the difference between the draft and the final poem is a really personal poem. And I feel like our identities are kind of embedded like in the process of like making the thing. I'm kind of like there's a place that I want the poem to be, you know, and I feel like it rarely gets there. So usually I have to just like stop myself and just kind of like be like at peace with what I created. I have a little, you know, like note on my desk that says, forgive yourself first. Like I always feel like you know, I'm falling short, like I can't do the thing that I hope to do. I'm trying to figure out like if I'm, you know, kind of capable or qualified to like address like my own imagination and ambition. And usually like the poem that I imagine is not the poem that I write, you know, so I kind of have to make peace with like everything kind of feels like a, you know, not necessarily like a failure, but like kind of a lesser version of the thing that I hoped for. So then I think in terms of revision, for me, like I'm trying, revision can be like an act of self-harm too, you know, because it's like, I'm not accepting my work. So I'm constantly like at odds with myself because I kind of want it to be something. And, you know, I can't always figure it out, you know, so usually I try and like pity people who publish me, you know, it's like, do you want that poem? It's like, are you sure you want to put that in a magazine? It's like, I mean, I'm happy that you would take it, you know, but it's like, you know, if I could show you the poem that I didn't write, if I could show you the poem that I couldn't figure out how to write, you would not publish that poem. So, you know, that's what it is.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Thank you for reminding me about Aura's work. I was introduced, but need to go back to it some more because I definitely come at it from a sculpting perspective, but the thinking of it from the other perspective too, to kind of push myself in that direction is really good.
Yeah, and it's not a race. I mean, I think we, just because of the way things work and people posting poems and like their reading schedules and like, you know, the glamour
Right.
you know, of poetry right now, you can feel like you're just on a treadmill. You know, the beauty is like nobody's waiting for your poems. You know, nobody's gonna ask you for your poems, right? So when you're done, you know, send them out, but don't feel like you have to. I mean, I was taught that like you should hesitate to show anybody your work. That like always like question that impulse. So like when you're ready, or when you think they're ready, you know, get them out there. But you know, but enjoy it. Enjoy the privacy and the all the insecurity kind of baked into being an artist. And you know, and then, and I guess I'll stop here because I don't want to keep you too long. I always think that when I'm done with a poem, you know, I've written it, it's on my desk, you know, I'm finished, right? Like, you know, the accomplishment is like making the poem concrete. But then the poems are there and they're just like stuck on my desk. So I think, you know, I have to figure out how to be an ambassador for my work, you know? So like, I don't want my emotional well-being to be connected to whatever reputation is, right? If I never publish anything, I mean, you know, obviously like we want, you know, audience or visibility and like all that stuff, but you can't like have that as your goal. Like the goal has to be to publish the poem. So like, there's a way that you kind of almost have to use like different muscle groups in terms of like ambition, right? There's the ambition of making the poem, and then there's the ambition to send those poems out into the world, you know, and then there's the idea of like what the poems will do for you, right? So you become, you know, a New Yorker poet, right? If you start off thinking about the New Yorker, you're going to write a bad poem, right? So you can't do that. So, you know, there's kind of a game that you have to play where it's like you have to be at peace with whatever you create and to kind of see that as like a destination, and then try and figure out, well, almost like you have to be like an agent or like an advocate for your poems, you know, as if they're like somebody else's work. You know, you're just like, oh, I'm just helping the poems out. You know, I don't need them, right? Like I've written them, so I'm done. But then you have to do something else to kind of cultivate, you know, like a different way of being, you know, like after the work has been done. So, you know, it's, you know, this thing that we've decided to do is, it's emotionally complicated, you know, but we're emotionally complicated anyway, you know, so like as soon as you accept that, you know, you kind of like own your strangeness. I think you can feel like a little bit of peace, but, you know, but it's a process. It's still kind of like a process for me. So you just have to be good to yourself.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amaud. You know, it's not a race. I love that. It makes me, I always think of the Goethe quote, never hurry, never rest. But this has been delightful, Amaud. I so appreciate you spending the time with us and giving us so much to think about. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you for having me, and you know, for being so supportive of my work. I mean, it's, you know, it's not a small thing, having this opportunity to talk to you. And you know, I know, you know, obviously this has been a really difficult time, and we're making the best of a bad situation. So, you know, I appreciate your company this morning.
Thanks. And I don't know if people saw the note. Can I get the M.F.A. students to stick around for 2 minutes before we break up, please?
Thank you, Bob.
Okay. Well, guess I'll take off.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, are we all right, thanks everyone. So I wanted to just touch base on 2 things, and I've asked Mystery to join us too as an accepted student who may be joining us. 2 things. One was this afternoon's happy hour on the schedule. Just so you know, we're at that point in the residency when I would envision that as much happens elsewhere as in the sessions, where you now start to, you know, have a coffee or a drink after a session and talk it through. And of course, we don't have that. So I tried to build in at least some time, you know, but I also know we're at a point in the residency when you might be tired or you might be working on study plans. It is really that moment on the schedule is really just about an opportunity for you. If you want to talk to each other, there's nothing planned. I will just have I'll have the Zoom link open. I may be in and out. And this might be something that you want to email to each other to see, are you going to be there? Do you want to talk? Do you want, you know, to see if you want to do that or not? And so there's no expectations, but I just thought I'd kind of throw that so you kind of, you know, you can decide what you want to do with that, or if you want to do with that. And then The other one question I had, we have nothing formal on the schedule for the last morning. It's really a chance for you to work with your advisor to make sure the study plans are wrapped up. I would like to add a half hour or so though. One, since you weren't able to meet with the librarian, I'd like you to meet with her, and I'd like to be able to just check back in with everybody. If I put something like 10 o'clock on the morning, that last morning, will people be able to make it?
That's the
Yes.
7th.
Yeah, the 7th.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, that's all I just wanted to check in on those two things. And so then you've got meetings coming up, and we're back as a group at 1. So I will see you then. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Glenn. You
Thank
said
you.
10 o'clock on the 7th?
Yeah, I'll send out a
Oh, okay.
link with it. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.